Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition. We are at poem 213, Did the Harebell Loose Her Girdle? Now, I find this a fascinating poem for a number of reasons. There's all kinds of interesting satiric games that are being played here. In some ways, we're back to the Eden poem of 211, Come Slowly Eden, another Eden poem. We're going to see Eden mentioned in this poem and then a poem to come as well. Now again, this poem has been interpreted in many different ways. Some will interpret it sexually, some will interpret it socially, some will interpret it very personally for Emily as it relates to, again, her publishing of poetry. But many have read this poem as the question of the loss of virginity, whether it's being directly or figuratively virginity. In other words, when certain activities happen, does that forever alter the experience after the fact? We're going to see all of this contained here. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm really hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm really hopeful that you've worked through the preceding 212 poems. We just finished with poem 212, Least Rivers. Now, this poem was actually published in 1891 under the title of Possession, which, I mean, this is going to make it an interesting reason to read the poem. In this poem, notice that Emily will dance with the notion of two gardens, a country garden and then, of course, the Garden of Eden. And immediately we're back to Milton's Paradise Lost, which will stand, I think, behind some of what's going on here. Some have called this such a versatile poem because there's so many different possible variants and readings. I think actually we're looking at Emily and her having a bit of fun, even her satire or her satiric voice. The Victorian attitude towards premarital sex, I think, is standing here. That is to say, in some ways, the guy always seems to lose respect for the woman who he has, quote-unquote, conquered. Let's see how she plays the game. And notice, this isn't loose, it's loose, as in to release. Did the Harebell loose her girdle to the lover bee? Would the bee the Harebell hollow much as formerly? Did the paradise, persuaded, yield her mote of pearl? Would the Eden be an Eden, or the Earl an Earl? Now, many readers of this poem will read this initially and say, I'm sorry, there are some of these poems that I can detect something of what's going on, but there's such a game of syntax and words here that it starts to become difficult to actually understand what I'm reading. And I think Emily is doing it intentionally. In other words, the syntax of the poem plays along with her satiric view that if you have certain experiences, if you want to call it sexual conquest, you can, then does that forever alter the dynamics and the relationships between the two parties? And I think Emily is playing around with any number of possible variants of reading here. Notice we'll begin with, first of all, the bluebell. This is the only use of Harebell in all of her poetry. The bluebell flower, it's a beautiful flower. And she asked this simple question: did the Harebell loose her girdle? In other words, invite the bee in. By the way, girdle is only used one and only one time here. It's provocative use. In other words, to undo the dress, if you will, to allow for the lover bee. And already, once you've got that image in your mind, the bee comes to the flower to extract, of course, as bees will do. And was the flower, the Harebell, the bluebell flower, was it complicit in doing this? And if so, now her question, would the bee, the Harebell, hollow, notice hollow here almost like respect, as in religious language, the church, much as formally? In other words, if the bee knows that the flower wanted it to come inside of it, now obviously you can see the sexual rendering, then will, in some ways, the bee no longer think of the flower in the same way? And the obvious question is, do certain kinds of experiences once had lessen or cheapen that experience? Now obviously you can think of this in sexual terms. Some have thought of it in terms of Emily and her publishing. That is to say, once Emily publishes some of her work, does in some ways that cheapen the experience for her? Many have read the poem that way. Down to the second stanza about paradise, and in 57 poems we've got paradise being used. We're going to pick up with paradise in poem 215. Obviously we were with Eden in 211. We'll get to Eden in a moment. Did the paradise, notice in quotation marks, and why in quotation marks? Well, some have said that this is her referencing of Milton and Paradise Lost. Some have argued that when she puts quotation marks around paradise, she is being euphemistic here. She's almost being sarcastic. Did the paradise, and then her use of the word persuaded will take us back to the use of the word loose, as in loose or girdle. Persuaded, did the paradise persuaded, we could say conquered, yield, back again to loose, yield her mote of pearl. Now, this is referencing Revelation 21:21, where in talking about, in the book of Revelation in the Bible, talking about paradise and heaven, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of one pearl. So notice Emily's kind of playing around with this revelation image of paradise, of heaven. Did the paradise persuaded yield her mote of pearl? And the use of mote is fascinating. We're going to see it in poem 262 and then in poem 1609. In poem 262, just to jump over there for a second, in that poem it will run like this. And ever since the purple mote they strive to climb in vain, as birds that tumble from the clouds do fumble at the strain. And then poem 1609, when we finally get there, that'll be a while for us to hit that poem. But in poem 1609, this is the game as she'll play it, with this use of the word mote. Sunset that screens reveals, enhancing what we see by menaces of amethyst and motes of mystery. In other words, the notion of it being the unknown. Yet, notice here, the language, because we're jumping to Eden and the Earl, will have to do with, obviously, certain kinds of folks, earls, the higher class, if you will. Did the paradise persuaded yield her mote of pearl? By the way, we'll be dancing with pearl in poem 214 as well. Would the Eden, that is to say paradise, be an Eden, or the Earl an Earl? In other words, a certain kind of change in status, the questioning of moral stability of rank. In other words, once the Earl has been able to persuade the woman of some kind of sexual liaison, will the Earl ever be able to see the woman in the same way again? Again, back to this question of Victorian views of virginity, if that's in fact the way that you read this poem. I think at 2A our message here is that people often care. I think Emily is definitely playing this game. People often care too much about silly stuff, especially as it relates to status socially. And in that regards, I think Emily is saying, sometimes we care a little bit too much about these kinds of things, because clearly the flower doesn't care in terms of the bee. At 2B, I love the ironic questions, the powerful rhetoric that's here, and the word choice, especially of the word girdle. It's a facet to loose the girdle. And then, of course, at 3A, we've already mentioned Revelation 21. Milton's Paradise Lost we've mentioned, and we've already dealt with poem 199. Go back to that one. I'm a woman now to save her. It's an interesting poem as you read it in relationship to this poem. But the text I want to play with is Scarlet Letter. Think about Hawthorne's 1850 publication. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on Scarlet Letter. But think about this one. This poem is written roughly 1860. So Emily definitely knows the story of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, and of course, what goes on there. Well, Dimmesdale, of course, can sleep with a woman, but he can't admit to sleeping with a woman. And of course, she has to, right? Hester has to carry the degrading letter A for adultery all of her life. And of course, what is the name of the young girl in that story? I believe it is Pearl. I find it interesting. Some of you smiling to say, oh yeah, it works rather nicely. Yes, it does. I think this is a poem that works rather nicely with your reading of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. Finally, in 3B, how do you deal with some folks being judged more harshly than others, especially in unfair ways because certain experiences have been had? And how do you read this poem? Do you read this poem as sexual? Do you read it as social? Do you read it as Emily's toying with the idea of publishing and the challenges of creatively letting stuff go, and in the process of doing so, maybe cheapening the Eden that is her own view of her poetry? I'll leave it to you to decide. Thank you.